Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. As always, it's been an action-packed couple of weeks.
Yes. And this is our 40th episode, which we are doing every 2 weeks. We do. So several big topics again today, Irina. So let's take the big one today itself. JD Vance in India. Now he's, if I understand, just some time back, he must be on his way home. So to understand things from your perspective, what does he take with him? What has he left here for India?
Well, I would say that this has actually been a relatively successful visit, much more so than his visit to the Vatican, which unfortunately ended in the Pope's death. Nobody died as a result of JD Vance visiting India, although unfortunately there has been a horrible terrorist attack, but we'll get to it. So as far as his travel there, he was there not simply as a bureaucratic emissary, but representing the entire foreign policy, which actually the Trump administration is betting a lot on its growing relationship with India, and a lot of it came through with the way it was handled. So the issues that were coming up included strategic realism, cultural sovereignty, and tech decoupling from China. So India is perceived by the Trump administration as an unapologetically sovereign country and a model ally in this Trumpian doctrine for foreign policy. So there's been several key focus areas. One of them was the recognition of India's multipolarity. Vance acknowledged India's energy ties to Russia and its diplomatic relations with Iran as legitimate expressions of sovereignty, not deviations from Western alignment. Now, part of that could be explained by the fact that the Trump administration itself is shifting very rapidly towards Russia and potentially looking to triangulate with Russia and India against China and also later on against Iran, as if the diplomatic engagement with Iran does not go as planned. So far, however, the meetings with Iran continued, and that may reflect in other foreign policy. In other words, Trump is less inclined to chide other countries for their respective engagement with Iran, since it could be seen as helpful in his own diplomatic efforts. Regardless of that, this is a gesture that the US under Trump does not feel threatened by India's energy policies. And to be frank, India has been shifting away from Russia on the energy issues anyway. So while these ties continue, they're no longer as advantageous for India as they once were. And there is a big energy deal with the US in the works as well. So that could be also part of the fact that Vance found it relatively easy to address that topic in that particular area. Now, another big one was the idea of tech realignment. Vance is advocating for Indian participation in US-led semiconductor and rare earths supply chains, and he wants the CHIPS Act, which is, Trump has been trying to do away with, but Vance actually wants to expand the incentives for India-based manufacturing, which could solve some of the criticisms and trade criticisms that Trump has proposed. Doing away with CHIPS Act completely is not something that the Congress supports, but amending it in a way that addresses some of the logistical shortcomings makes sense, and India could be part of that solution. Now, of course, there are some difficulties. There's a battle between the some of the MAGA and isolationist and xenophobic elements, and we've seen that already between rear its head between Elon Musk and the Steve Bannon camp over visa issues. But to be honest, this U.S. has limited options in tackling this issue, given the skills gap and the labor shortage required for such an undertaking. So now they're looking for practical applications, and India is part of the solution. The third key element of that visit was cultural diplomacy. Vance praised India's Hindu civilizational identity, emphasized the need for mutual respect, pushed back against legacy US criticisms on religious freedom and alleged democratic backsliding. And of course, he visited various people with his family, who is his wife is of Indian descent, and the children also proudly share in Indian cultural heritage. Of course, these official topics were only part of the focus. There were also behind the scenes discussions with Indian startups on AI regulation and quantum research. US is in a race against time against China, which keeps alleging major quantum breakthroughs and is yet to demonstrate measurable progress in that area in a way that's ascertainable. But we do know that as part of BRICS, India and China may be engaged in tech exchanges and collaborations towards speeding up quantum research, and US looks to counter that with practical applications. There were also closed door meetings with RSS and BJP aligned think tanks focused on tech nationalism and strategic decoupling from China, which is, of course, continues to be a major concern for both countries. There was also a quiet engagement on supporting India's permanent seat at the UN Security Council under a conservative restructuring plan. Now, the Trump administration has threatened to withdraw much of its funding for the United Nations, but so far that has been largely at rumor stage, with an ally as part of an expanded permanent member plan. It could be that US could gain more significant leverage on some key issues. Of course, Trump himself views India as an indispensable bulwark against China and a natural ally in what he's calling civilizational realism. So Vance's visit was greenlit as part of a broader realignment of US priorities in Asia, less democracy promotion, more capacity building, which was very much expected from the Trump administration. None of this comes as a big surprise. And there are practical outcomes worth underscoring, which include the formation of a Senate India Strategic Caucus, which is being very much pushed by Vance and his allies in the Senate. Of course, Vance himself was a senator before becoming the VP. The idea is to push bipartisan investment in defense tech collaboration, another major relatively new development, which for many years, including during Trump's first term, was basically stalled, started moving along under Biden, and has accelerated now in Trump's second term. Another issue that is being practically implemented now is the acceleration of talks on US-India semiconductor and critical mineral initiative, which was announced earlier to undercut Chinese supply chain monopolies, which has been a big issue. And after Trump's announcements of tariffs, China has also limited or outright banned some key rare earth elements which are strategically important in defense and other technological advancements. There is also information, a new informal channel for aligning nationalist governance models between New Delhi and Washington. So So all of these things are going to be backed by Vance working with Congress to push appropriate legislative initiatives to provide legislative backing to the executive initiatives as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. But my question is to understand whether it was more of optics, speaking the right words, talking the right topics, and just passing the right message. But can, in these changing times when people are talking, Europe is talking, other countries are talking, can the US be trusted? Do you think the Indian administration, they will also be also looking at it from understanding how the US is looking inwards and not going to give anything without taking anything?
Yeah, that's been a major concern, and it's been a particular major concern in terms of the tariff discussions. One of the big issues was, of course, India's tariffs on cars and other products. Shortly before Vance's visit, Elon Musk and Prime Minister Modi had a call, since Musk is looking to open a Tesla production in India, but the tariffs have been a major stumbling block. Moreover, tariffs in general have been an issue of behind the scenes negotiations since Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States, meaning for several months now. These negotiations have been working towards creating a foundation for a bilateral trade agreement. The framework would include substantial tariff reductions, particularly on US agricultural exports, which is a major concession from India, which is known internationally for protectionist trade policies, a historic issue. As for Washington, allegedly, it's been fairly flexible on tech exports and defense industrial partnerships, where India wants deeper access and wants co-production rights. Another major issue with India's policy, we have seen that it's also been the case with Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union. India and Russia have been involved in co-production of a lot of the technology. It makes sense that India will, as it's seeking better innovation, is looking to transition to a similar model, and that is a less of a stumbling block for the Trump administration than the tariff issue. Just a few days ago, some of these issues have been announced to be locked in place, and today the formal talks have started to discuss some of this and to continue discussing the tariff concerns. The digital economy in particular has been a major stumbling block in that effect. India is very much prioritizing data localization, and it's got fairly vigorous regulations restricting foreign e-commerce entities, which the American tech companies find as a major business stumbling blocks as they're seeking to move into the Indian markets. US wants open access for its digital services, and for India, its policies are considered essential to digital sovereignty and consumer data protection. Negotiations have yielded so far partial consensus on interoperability, taxation frameworks, content moderation standards. So it looks like India and US could come to some sort of at least partial agreements on some of these issues. There's also been discussions on visa and labor front. India is looking for expanded mobility for skilled laborers, and that's gaining traction because, as I mentioned, US needs skilled laborers, engineers, and others for semiconductor production and for many other Silicon Valley linked tech businesses. The White House maintains a hardline immigration stance domestically, but it's strategically they understand that they need the Indian talent in sustaining competitiveness. Just as the Trump administration excluded technologies from the tariff framework, similarly, the visa framework and enforcement may exclude high-tech agreement. Discussions are still ongoing to uncouple high-skilled visa quotas from the broader immigration policy, which would shift the administration towards more sector-specific arrangements and less just general enforcement across the board, which quite frankly has been rivaling Indian officials and others. We have seen scandalous instances of elderly Indian families being harassed after extended stays abroad. Even permanent residents have been pushed to self-deport at the airports. We have seen a visa issue over a family whose daughter ended up in a coma after an attack in the United States. So all of these incidents have not been helpful in promoting good relations, because when there is this restriction over immigration, it's difficult to communicate. It's difficult to work together, and there's also a lot of thorny issues to work out on other fronts. There's another major sector continuing with Prime Minister Modi's, which is pharmaceuticals. India is the world's largest generic supplier, and it's looking to lower regulatory barriers in the US. The American pharma firms are continuing to press for stronger intellectual property enforcement, and both seem flexible, and they may want to carve out sort of a hybrid model, strengthening patent timelines for breakthrough drugs while maintaining compulsory licensing options for critical public health situation. India is also agreeing to slash tariffs on over half of its imports from the US from the previous year, which is a major, you might say even an unprecedented move, reflecting both geopolitical calculation and domestic economic urgency. So yes, to your point about whether this is a quid pro quo, really transactional arrangement, it is and it isn't. It is in the sense that Trump is clearly demanding things in exchange, but it's also part of a broader realignment, and it's also answering to India's own interests. So it works out, even though it's less focused on values-based system and more focused on transactional interests. But because of the wide variety of issues in so many different sectors, it comes out to be as a broad relationship based shift anyway, just because of the sheer quantity of arrangements to make, and because it's so comprehensive, and given that both sides are showing a fair degree of flexibility, I would say that despite the fact that a values-based framework is preferable in the long term, for now at least it seems to be working out in a fairly agreeable way as far as these things go.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. One more point on this is that a lot of this we are understanding that is all due to China, decoupling from China, disentangling from China. Do you think this sort of a US policy or friendship with India, looking in that, India has always been friendly to the US in certain aspects. But do you think this sort of understanding from the Trump administration that is going to last? Because then you don't build friendship. And how do you think then China will be watching all this? It is its close neighbor, and China will also try to engage with India differently than going forward.
Well, let's separate the Trump administration from the United States, because the Trump administration is here for another 4 years, whereas the long-term relations are not going anywhere. And we are seeing that on the business level, and as well as in terms of general trends, the relationship is actually growing closer out of both need and interest. And we are seeing that businesses are looking to engage with each other, and businesses don't like to invest in the short term because it doesn't make sense for them. Long-term investments make more sense. So it makes, so separately from whatever Trump is prioritizing and separately from what happens with China, a lot of these businesses have been shifting out of China even before Trump for their own interest, because the prices in China have been rising, because there have been internal shifts in China's own policies that have been unfriendly to the West, and also because they want to make business in more places, not just China. And India has also been rolling back regulations and making business easier. So a combination of these factors ensures that there is a long-term and more stable relationship on a practical and business level that goes beyond Trump. The fact that there is a very large Indian diaspora in the US and these people are US citizens makes it difficult to ignore these in-person ties, even with the immigration issues that I mentioned. And this transcends the specific administration in office at the moment. Yes, I agree that Trump, by focusing excessively on China to the detriment of other aspects of the relations, is maybe losing out. That said, I think even if you ignore China completely, the things that are happening right now are objectively beneficial to both countries. Defense tech exchanges, regardless of whether it's China or Houthis or Somali pirates or just general preparedness, those are good things regardless of who is the villain of the story, and whether, just for boosting your own power projection. There are other things that are happening that have nothing to do with China, like space exploration, like pharmaceuticals. Clearly those are practical needs that go far beyond whatever China is or isn't doing. So I wouldn't say that it's all entirely only focused on China, but there is an element that I think the US and many even businesses, the fact that they're so focused on seeing India as a competitor to China right now, they may be in for a disappointment, because the decoupling process in general is probably going to take a lot longer and will be more difficult and painful than people are willing to concede. So they need to be realistic about how that works for both sides. By the way, both sides have trade relations and a lot of investments from China in their countries. California's now fourth largest economy in the world is heavily subsidized by Chinese investments. So none of that is going to be easy. So if people are looking for easy answers in the face of India or from the United States, that's not going to happen. The other issue is India is still developing country with many internal obstacles and issues, which means that the race with China is also not going to be smooth, and even in all directions is going to be a lot of ups and downs, and there's going to be a lot of uneven development with rapid progress in some areas and slow progress in others. And this is where US know-how and best practice sharing and multilateral relationships should come in as a backup, and also as a way to move these things forward. If the US is not thinking in that direction, they're making a major mistake and they're in for a big disappointment. That's just the reality of the situation.
Absolutely, Irina. And one more thing on a lighter note. You see, if I understand, JD Vance, he was telling Prime Minister Narendra Modi that, you see, your rating is such great that I am almost jealous because of your ratings. Now he goes back and he finds Trump's ratings have fallen on all those patterns, by so many agencies. What will he tell Trump? That, listen, you got to work on the ratings, and that is where my next question is.
Well,
why is Trump's ratings falling so fast? Just just a few months after coming to the to power. Help us understand. Don't the now will he face problems domestically? How do you see this going forward?
Well, a lot of this has to do with the implementation of his policies. There are some policies that remain popular, but because of the way Trump is executing them, he's losing popularity even in those areas. And migration and border security is one of them. That was one of the top issues which brought him back to office. But now, even in that area, he's seeing rapidly falling numbers. because of the communication about it, and also because of the implementation process. It's seen as very chaotic, uneven. Trump himself has not been consistent. For instance, one day he seems to be focusing more on legal resident on permanent residents and tourists than on violent offenders, and also random people are getting dragged around, whereas his explicit plan was to focus entirely on violent offenders as a top priority and then go in phases. Now he's making very self-serving exceptions, such as for immigrants working on farms and his hotels, and that is seen, as a very mixed message, even as European and other tourists are getting kicked out of the country for the slightest excuse, and random non-violent individuals who overstay their visa or whatever are getting sent to prison with violent offenders in El Salvador. That's not to say that violent offenders don't belong in prison, but not without due process, not without vetting in the United States. And if they're not actually violent offenders, they definitely don't belong in prison at all, much less with criminals. So, violent criminals. So the optics of all of this, the complaints, the falling tourism from Europe, from Canada, this is not good for the economy. This is actually having an impact on businesses that are supported by tourism. Hotels are suffering, small businesses are suffering, and these are parts of Trump's base. These are the people who voted for Trump because they were expecting an economic recovery and more business, not horrible backlash over the handling of sensitive diplomatic relationships. And nobody wanted huge numbers of human traffickers and drug dealers coming into the country, and cities were being overwhelmed by humanitarian crisis over having to handle an influx of migrants with no ability to sustain that economically or otherwise. But nobody was also wanted to kick out permanent residents or people who haven't done anything wrong, or tourists. That was not part of the plan. That was not part of the package. And that's just one issue. The tariffs have been a mess. They wiped out trillions from the economy, and that's impacted middle-class Americans, not the billionaires, some of whom actually made money on volatility markets, but regular people who keep their pensions and in stable accounts, who don't speculate on volatile markets. For them, this has been a destabilizing experience, and their funds have not fully recovered. And Trump has been making messages that create more and more volatility, and the markets respond to all of that. And the tariff war, there's also a lack of confidence over the fact that there's no consistency in implementation. One day he says that he's waging a war on everybody. The next day it's mostly China, but he still maintains tariffs on everybody else at a lower level. Today he's saying we'll escalate with China, and the next day he drops all his demands and capitulates after making the claim that it's all about China and squeezing China. So China is the one that benefits, and none of that is actually helping anybody. And frankly, to have any policy succeed, you need to have a strategy. It needs to be consistent. If you want to squeeze China from tariffs, you need a coalition of allies. You need to coordinate tariffs. You need to work with India, with the European Union, with Canada, Japan, all these other countries who are interested in countering China. You cannot be handling it alone. You cannot be waging tariff wars with everybody else. You cannot be ruining your relations with everyone else. You need to have a transition plan for your businesses. You need to have a phased approach to tariffs. You can't just randomly escalate and leave all the businesses that depend on Chinese imports to drown, or to offer bailouts that are going to be below market value and are going also without countering opportunity and growth into the equation. And you certainly cannot do so without also providing alternative means for people to do business. If you are going to squeezing out one country, you need to have either domestic or foreign alternatives for the same types of products to avoid consumer dissatisfaction and also your own businesses from failing. None of that has been done, and so there's a very widespread middle class dissatisfaction. It's not just leftists who are biased against Trump. It's people who voted for Trump who are being misled and deceived about what these policies actually mean for them.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irene. I'm sure Mr. JD Vance must have, taken some special tips from Prime Minister Modi how to keep ratings, because he must be a worried man if he has ambitions of fighting for the office, the biggest office 4 years later. But looking at the things there means, can you explain two issues? Let's look at that. One is the Ukraine part. If you look at the Ukraine part, and even from the China part, it's almost childish behavior. First, you are telling, that you'll get the deal done, and then you are telling, I'll walk out from this bill. The US will walk out of this. Why would Russia listen to it? And again, you are criticizing Zelensky. Where is it that they are trying to, reach here? Even in China, first you put on tariffs, and then you talk about no, it is too high. It will not be too high. This much high. It will not be zero, but it will be substantially lower, something like that. So the world is very confused. Even you just don't know what to stick to. I don't know whether this is diplomacy, foreign relations, or ending the war or not. Help us understand, or is there a strategy behind all of this, Irene?
Well, there is a strategy between Russia and Ukraine. It's just not the one many people want to admit. The strategy is that US is pivoting to Russia. It's very simple. So all of the events that we have seen in the last few months, starting with the catastrophic meeting with Zelensky and the minerals deal, and all of that was never about any of that. It was all about pleasing Russia and showing, and shifting U.S. preference to Russia. And none of it was really about what's better for U.S. national security. We know that Witkoff has business associations in Russia, whereas he does not have those relationships in Ukraine. And it's simply doing business with whoever he is more comfortable with. And Witkoff is a handpicked associate of Donald Trump. He's one of his most trusted people. He's basically taken over the policy from Rubio and from other foreign policy officials, and he's basically running the show and turning foreign policy into business deals almost exclusively. So if you want to understand what's about Ukraine, has nothing to do with ending the war, has nothing to do with preventing, escalation. It has nothing to do with anything other than business with Russia. Regarding China, this also is not the case of the Trump 1.0, who used the element of surprise to keep adversarial states of balance, and it worked. The thing is, if you do that, if you're consistent and once in a while you'll throw in a surprise, that is a workable strategy. You want to keep your enemies guessing. However, you are supposed to communicate with your allies. They are not supposed to be the ones of balance, and you supposed to know what you yourself are doing. It's supposed to be strategic. It should be a surprise to everyone, but not to your own administration. But the lack of coordination, the complete dysfunction inside the government, as well as Trump's inability to negotiate effectively, is what's causing complete mayhem in both the policy itself and its implementation. I don't think he's going to be tough on China at all. I think China is winning. We saw what happened with the TikTok sale. That was emblematic. Trump campaigned on running against TikTok. Then at the first opportunity, he tried to buy it out. Ironically, the deal failed because of the tariffs. Now he extended a lifeline to TikTok. The entire conversation about TikTok's harm has died. It's literally, you won't find even one article about it anymore anywhere. And we don't know what's going to happen with that, because nobody is actually talking how the damage from it will be handled if ByteDance returns to the negotiation table and returns with the control of the very same algorithm that's been harvesting American data, um, advancing all these nefarious propaganda campaigns and so on and so forth. None of it is actually being resolved. Now, this whole caving in on China's war shows that Trump is he miscalculated. He did not do the due diligence to understand what China's response was actually going to be, and he also did not calculate what sort of economic damage it was going to do to the US and how the people would respond. He thought that everybody would just go along with it for as long as it takes. I don't think there was ever a clear plan for any of it.
Right, Irina. One more thing I want to understand, and then we'll come to the terrorist attack in India, is that this U.S. minerals deal, rumors and some reports about talking with Pakistan because, China restrictions on rare earths. Tell us a bit about this. Means how does it look like? What rare earths does Pakistan have, which the world did not know, and the U.S. knows about this?
Well, here's the thing. It's actually almost irrelevant because I don't think it's going to happen, to be honest. The reason it's not going to happen is because, and we're talking about things like copper and gold and lithium. Lithium is also something that India has in abundance, by the way. And it's actually finally approved lithium for exports a while back. But it still might take time before it actually starts being exported. US, by the way, also has lithium, has not been mining it. Pakistan does have deposits of all of these things, but it's not going to happen for a very simple reason. Pakistan is basically a Chinese colony. So why would China, that's looking to restrict the United States from being able to, stop China from advancing its own military technologies and so forth, why would it let Pakistan, that's $20 billion in debt that we know of, export anything to the United States? Unless US is willing to buy out Pakistan from Chinese influence and invest as much into it as China did, I don't think that is happening. I can't imagine how that would actually work. I don't know why they even bothered announcing such a thing. I think it's embarrassing and shows a complete lack of understanding of what's going on, frankly.
Absolutely. And now coming back to the terrorist attack in India, means why did it? There was a huge lull, big lull, where since the last attack, and suddenly all of it, especially when JD Vance was here. Every time the US president is in the country, in India, there seems to be a bit of, all these things happening. Tell us a bit, how do you see it from that part of the world? India has taken very strong measures and looks like it will be a time to. But strangely, you see, the world has condemned it. Even China has condemned it, if I understand it, not the exact words. And Pakistan also has shown concern. How do you look at it from every perspective that you can think of?
So this attack was particularly complex. First of all, it was exceptionally well timed. I believe the fact that a US official was traveling to the country was probably most likely part of the plan to cause massive embarrassment and to undermine US and Indian security cooperation and just to show weakness. So what we're talking about is not just terrorism for the sake of causing pain and suffering. It was a hit. It was a hit because 25 Indian security personnel were killed. So this was clearly highly structured, highly intelligence-backed, government-backed attack, an act of war, I would say, not just terrorism. Even if, terrorist cells were responsible for the actual handbook, there was no way something like that could have happened without government intelligence. It was attributed to an LET sleeper cell, LET has links to ISI handlers in Pakistan, and it was very much narrative warfare. It was very much information warfare to deal a moral, psychological blow to the Indian government, and not simply to cause terror to the Kashmiris living in there. It was a very much a targeted attack, because especially shocking, because lately Kashmir was considered increasingly integrated into a sense of normalcy. It's become a point of pride, a point of investments by the Indian government, and this was disrupted. And I would almost compare it to October 7th in the psychological impact and the type of planning that went into it, the type of surprise attack to kind of disrupt the status quo, not just to terrorize people, because you can terrorize people anywhere on the subway in a major city, but to cause this shock that this area that was considered to be now normalized and safe and invested is now once again being under attack, under siege, on an offensive when everyone least expected, when Pakistan appeared to be improving its relations with the Gulf states, even with India itself, with the West. All of a sudden, lo and behold, they start a major offensive which may have completely unpredictable results, given that we're talking about two nuclear powers. Anything in such a scenario is possible if you can have a major military escalation out of a complete, a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. And by the way, that has happened in the past. We've had this, there have been such incidents between the two countries, an extremely risky, reckless move, but that shows that this is not just about Pakistan and India. There's something much deeper going on. It's not just the Pakistani government. I personally believe that there are other actors involved, and whoever is pulling the strings does not have Pakistan's best interests in place, and whoever in Pakistan is cooperating with those larger interests is willing to risk everything for the sake of dealing this blow, knowing what a high risk escalation that it can draw the two countries into tensions that will be very difficult to recover from. Let's look at what has happened so far. India has escalated military readiness. Commander units are being deployed along key regional sectors. Drone surveillance intensified. Missile batteries are on alert. Pakistani High Commission staff cut by 50%. Major downgrade in diplomatic relations. Multilateral forums flooded with counter narratives on Pakistani terror sponsorship. Major information warfare, very aggressive, calling for escalation, which again is part of this thing that can lead to an actual escalation at any moment. Indian state-linked social media networks launching a global push with hashtags, infographics, and AI-generated content exposing ISI operations. What is Pakistan doing? It's issuing denials through diplomatic channels, press briefings, alleging false flags and Indian human rights abuses in Kashmir. First sign of guilt. They're not showing any clear satellite or other counter information that would put anyone at risk. They're instead distracting, and they're preparing the sort of narrative that Russia has prepared against Ukraine, claiming that they are back in the day Russia used the narrative that they are liberating and denazifying Ukraine, that there are allegedly ethnic human and religious human rights abuses in Ukraine, while projecting their own things. And this is exactly what Pakistan appears to be doing. This is a Russian model of information warfare. And I've mentioned previously that Russia and Pakistan Russia has been courting Pakistan, and Russia has been co-opting Islamist figures and particular factions. I can't say that they control all of the Pakistan's elites. That's simply not true. But they have influence and ties with particular groups, particular intelligence agencies, and we are seeing the same style of narratives that is being prepared, the same diversion of attention, and the same whataboutism and projection of its own issues to justify potential action. So they're not even trying to really defend themselves as much as blaming India for what has transpired, which is basically to claim to justify that the attack was against Indian personnel engaged in abuses, that this was a legitimate attack in self-defense. This is what they're trying to claim by Indian nationals. Typical proxy warfare.
Right. So where do you see now? India has taken very strong exception to this. Already things have moved very quickly from the government side. Where do you see these things in the next 1 month or so?
Well, we're already seeing major problems because Pakistan is not simply issuing, diplomatic statements. They're coordinating cyber disruption campaigns, so real cyber warfare, targeting Indian electoral systems, press databases, and even military communications centers. So we could see a major cyber war, kind of like what happened between Russia and Estonia, between Iran and Israel at one point, in what's increasingly happening between US and China. There are also psyops that are being boosted, Telegram channels and TikTok influencers spreading rumors of internal Indian dissent, another common thing in such wars. Publicly, the US has defended India and basically said India has the right to defend its sovereignty. Privately, Saudi and UAE diplomatic back channels are being activated to prevent escalation into a full military conflict, but at the same time, Saudis and UAE are backing away. Saudis and UAE are backing away from Pakistan, and they are basically already kind of cooling their own relations, and that is very noticeable. I have to say, all of this is crazy because, in addition to JD Vance's visit to India, Prime Minister Modi just paid a very important visit to Saudi Arabia. He met with the Crown Prince, and there was a number of agreements and discussion points about energy, technology, and other issues that were held and very much advancing the relationship between those two countries. So the optics of it are crazy. Think about it. The Indian Prime Minister is visiting Saudi Arabia, which has been one of the leading patrons of Pakistan, just as this major attack on Indian personnel is occurring. Clearly, again, I do not believe it's a coincidence at all. It was a major offensive aimed not only at India, but its allies, its relationships, this entire framework of Saudi, Indian, Middle Eastern general cooperation, the framework that Trump and the United States have been counting on to advance their own paradigmatic shift about the regional relationships, about economic and security connectivity in the region. This, in my opinion, is not just a terrorist operation against India along the lines of so many that India has suffered in the past. This, I believe, is major provocation and a major civilizational confrontation that we are seeing, and I think it's backed by far more actors than it's ever been in the past. This is not a small local back and forth between ISI and along with the assorted terrorists. I believe there are multiple probably actors involved, and they're looking to create this major access-based confrontation against multiple actors. This is an indirect message to the Gulf states, to moderate leaders who are not Islamist and who are pro-Western. This is also a taunt to the United States, daring the U.S. to act in some way amidst U.S. isolationism, retreat from the international scene. Not a coincidence at all. Very symbolic, very impactful, very meaningful, very well thought out, and very daring and brazen in a way that would not have been possible in the past. There were multiple attacks bigger than this one, but they were all none of them were necessarily linked to so many high-profile political events as we have seen. This is a huge call to the leadership at the top level, not just merely a terrorist skirmish to cause popular suffering.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure the world is watching this event very, very closely, and we will be seeing a lot of developments on this. We'll keep posted to our audience posted on this in our next episode. But before that, we've talked about wars, we have talked about tariff war, we have talked about terrorists and violence, and let's talk about some peace. Let's talk about Pope Francis, and he passes away. Let's talk about him. How do we look at his passing away? First Latin American pontiff, he dies, but his legacy will live on. How do you see his whole legacy from what you are seeing, Irina?
Look, there's a lot of people who supported him because they felt his style was much more suitable to common people. It was very populist, it was very simple, it was based in basically very compassionate talk. But to be honest, there's and he was also the first Jesuit pope as well. Also, major thing for Latin America. But his background is in Soviet-backed liberation theology. There's no getting away from the fact that this movement that the Soviet Union back in the day pushed throughout Latin America, as well as many of the African countries where they were active, was anti-Western, was based in communist principles, affecting and co-opting religious principles, and it has affected Pope Francis's vision of the world. We know that because of his moral equivalency with respect to Ukraine, with respect to Hamas, and many other issues. And some people have praised him for reforms inside the church, for giving more space to women, and so on and so forth. But this legacy of moral equivalence on moral issues, I think this has turned off many devoted Catholics who do see it as a moral Catholic imperative to stand up to evil and to fight just wars. And quite frankly, the Jesuit doctrine is very much a backer of the just war theory. So Pope Francis broke with his own tradition in favor of the liberation theology element that is not actually part of the Jesuit tradition, historically speaking.
Absolutely. The world is changing, and this time no clear front runner for the next pope. How do you think? The world is changing. Do you think now they will change how they looked at the selection of pope in 2013? Now it will be a much more different way the cardinals will look at this. How do you see the future of the next pope, and as well the future of the way the church will be functioning?
I would caution against making early predictions about how it will go, because the process is as political as it is religious and tradition based. After all, Vatican is also a self-contained government and not just a religious institution. And I believe that everyone who is there, and there's 7 leading candidates, which is a lot, has interest. There's going to be a lot of back and forth, a lot of political intrigue. And I think the outcome could be surprising, or it could be a compromise solution, but it could be entirely predictable based on the trends that Pope Francis set in place, putting in people who followed his lead. But once again, we don't know how many of the cardinals he appointed early in life versus late in life when he was ill, how many of them were true loyalists of his ideological or faith doctrine, and how many were just following the Pope's lead, only to turn to their own vision as soon as the opportunity allows them to. It's going to be very interesting to watch. I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be different whoever it ends up being, even if they appear to be a follower of Pope Francis. I think ultimately they will cast their own vision and shape their own legacy in their own unique way. I just think that they will try to learn from the best approaches of people who inspire them, and of course we will know a lot by the name they select, because traditionally that shows what tradition, which pope they are more likely to follow in the application of their principles, even if it's not the exact same tradition. And you of course, I think it's going to be, we're hearing a lot of opinion of people, but to be honest, I think none of these people, unless they've spent years studying the writings of each cardinal, I don't think they necessarily know what's going on either. I think no one outside the conclave really does.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so the world will watch a lot of events, a lot of development on this front. With this, it's set up on this very special edition of the World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.